Commissioner Hopkins.
Here.
Commissioner Khan.
Here.
Commissioner Wolkin.
Here.
Commissioner Dondekar.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Quincy.
Here.
And Chair Jorgensen.
Here. Thank you. So first we'll have the Pledge of Allegiance, and then after that we'll have an oath of office for our new member. I'll lead the Pledge of Allegiance. Do we have a flag? And commissioners, you might mute your microphones because there's a lot of echo if we're all speaking at once, it turns out. Here we go. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now we have the oath of office, and Deputy City Clerk Christian, would you please administer that oath?
Absolutely. So this oath of office is for our new commissioner, Emily Francis. Commissioner Francis, just so you know, when I say state your name, you are going to state your name, not just repeat after me. So if you could hold up your right hand and repeat after me. I state your name, do solemnly affirm.
I, Emily Francis, do solemnly affirm
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
And the Constitution of the State of California.
and the Constitution of the State of California
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance
To the Constitution of the United States.
to the Constitution of the United States
And the Constitution of the State of California.
and the Constitution of the State of California.
That I take this obligation freely.
That I take this obligation freely
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
I furthermore agree to abide by the rules,
I furthermore agree to abide by the rules,
regulations, and laws of the City of San Luis Obispo.
regulations, and laws of the City of San Luis Obispo.
Great, congratulations. I will be sending you this document via DocuSign for an e-signature tomorrow.
Oh, good. And we have a full house for the first time in quite a while, partly because members have been absent, but also we had a hole with Michelle moving up to the council. So Emily, this is so good. Glad you're here. So the first item is public comment on items that are not on tonight's agenda. So these items are generally referred to staff, and if action by the commission is necessary, it may be scheduled for a future meeting. Kevin, are there any public comments or any hands up to make a public comment?
Not as yet. Let's give the audience a little bit of time to sort through the instructions. I'll just go over them verbally. As Chair Jorgensen said, if you would like to speak on an item that is not on the current agenda, this is the time to do so. If you could raise your virtual hand, I will call on you and you will have 3 minutes to speak. We'll just give you a few more seconds. All right, seeing none, Chair Jorgensen, back to you.
Okay. Then the next item, we have no public comment tonight. The next item is a consent agenda item, the minutes of November 17th. Do I have a motion? If there's no one suggesting edits or changes of any sort.
Mr. Chair, I have
Yeah.
a question about the minutes, or maybe an edit.
Sure, go ahead, Mike.
I don't know if the clerk can show this on the screen or we need to, but condition 68 changes in the minutes end with kind of a phrase, and it looks like it's either intended to go on to continue, or maybe it was an error, a typo. It ends with the words "and the central," and it seems like there should be something more, or maybe those words should be struck. So maybe it's just a typo. I'm not sure.
Yeah, good catch.
This is Deputy Clerk Christian. I believe that reference was the central area.
Okay, I don't have it in front of me, so I don't know if that makes sense. Fine.
Sure, I can read the condition. Condition 68, unless otherwise waived by the city, the use of pervious struck out, pavers or alternate, which is added, paving materials as visual cues for pedestrians should be expanded to include some of the more extensive parking areas serving the commercial lease spaces, common area, clubhouse, the central pedestrian crossroads area, and the northerly shared parking area on lots 9 and 11, and the central area.
Okay, I guess that sounds right.
That makes sense.
I think it sounds fine because, Mike, it would have to be the central pedestrian area, blah, blah, and they've just articulated it in the sentence earlier.
The line above, yeah.
Okay, unless
that's-
there are
So-
no other comments, I'll make a
You-
motion to approve the minutes of November 17th.
Good.
I
So
second.
a second from Hema. Any other discussion? Could you call the roll then, please, Kevin?
Commissioner Khan,
Yes.
Commissioner Hopkins,
Yes.
I'm going to skip Commissioner Francis because she was not part of the commission at that time. Vice Chair, I did this in the wrong order. I'm so sorry,
It's okay.
but we'll keep going. Vice Chair Quincy,
Yes.
Commissioner Wilkin,
Yes.
Commissioner Dondekar,
Yes.
and Chair Jorgensen.
Yes. Good. So we've approved those minutes. It's time to move on to the first public hearing. And this public hearing is focused on 1320 Roundhouse Street. It's a review of the draft environmental impact report. And it was prepared for the Lowson Rail Corridor Agency Central Coast Layover Facility. Could we start out then with the staff report? Brian Lavelle, are you going to make that, please? I see you. Hi.
Yes, Chair Jorgensen, I just have a few introductory comments to make here. Again, Brian Lavelle, Senior Planner, Community Development Department. Just a few points here before I hand this off to the Lowsan team. Just to remind the commission and the public, the purpose of the meeting is to provide comments to Lowsan and their environmental consultants on the draft EIR. Comments should be focused on the environmental analysis rather than the merits of the project itself. That's pretty standard for the commission on these types of projects. I think the commission's pretty used to reviewing EIRs that come before the commission. Here's where it gets a little bit different. As far as the next steps, the EIR process here, Lowsan basically takes it from here. The city does not have discretion or jurisdiction over the project. And unless Lowsan elects to come back, the Planning Commission will not be asked to make a recommendation or take action on the project in the future. In addition to any comments received from the public and the commission at tonight's meeting, staff is also continuing to review the draft EIR and working on a comment letter That letter prepared by city staff will be provided to LoSAN prior to the close of public comment on December 20th. The LoSAN Rail Corridor Agency will carry out the next steps in the EIR process, including the possible certification of the final EIR and any approvals for the layover facility. Unless there's any questions for me at this time, I'd like to go ahead and hand it off to James Campbell of the LoSAN Rail Corridor Agency.
Yeah, let me check real quickly. Michael, do I see you with your hand raised? No. Is there anyone who has questions of Brian?
Chair Jorgensen, I had
Yeah.
a quick question of Brian.
Mhm.
Brian, when we provided some comments on this some time ago, when the project was brought before us, were those comments communicated at the time to LoSAN, or will they be part of the comments you provide again this time, or will you be concentrating just on the EIR? Because there were circulation issues and other kind community embeddedness kind of comments we had made in that first go around.
Sure, Commissioner Dandekar, the comments were provided to LoSAN. And I believe what you're going to hear in the presentation is a response to some of those comments that were received relating to the EIR. Some of the comments were more sort of policy, more commentary on the project itself. And I think that the LoSAN team is going to focus on specifically out of those comments, what related to the draft preparation of the draft environmental impact report. That was just really essentially the comments on in preparation of the draft environmental impact report. And now that the draft EIR is out, staff continues to review the EIR with the idea to have a more, I guess you could say, robust analysis and commentary as to the adequacy of the document.
Thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners? Brian? You know, I can't see all of you at once. That was a big advantage, only having 4 or 5 members at some meetings. Everybody showed up on the screen at the same time. I have one quick question, Brian, and that is, will the LoSAN members have had a chance to see the public communications that have come to the city most in the last few days about this project?
The consideration to adopt the final EIR should include a response to comments. So any of the comments that have been made should be included in that response to comments, with either just the response being only in the response to comments, or there should be some reference as to where some analysis has been provided for in the EIR based on those comments. Does that answer your question?
Mostly, yeah. So that means that if we wish to ask a question and maybe frame it in relation to a comment that came in, they may or may not have seen that comment. Got it.
That's good. They should have seen any comments that were made in the scoping meeting back on March 10th.
Right.
And the LoSAN team's been made aware of I think we just have 2 pieces of correspondence that have come in on this item. So yes, they should be aware of the comments. And the LoSAN team may be able to answer the questions now, or they may just have to take note and address the comments in the EIR.
Perfect. Why don't you go ahead and introduce your panel then of LoSAN representatives.
Hey, James, you want to go ahead? And
Okay,
take it
sorry.
away? No
I
problem.
apologize there. Good evening, commissioners. It's good to see you again. My name is James Campbell. I'm the operations officer for the LoSAN Rail Corridor Agency. We're the agency that is charged with the management and administration of the Pacific Surfliner service. And my presentation today to you will kind of give you kind of a brief overview of the project again and where we are today with that. An overview of the draft EIR, its process, some of the issues that were identified and some of the potential mitigations and conclusions there, as well as, again, for how to submit public comments on the draft EIR, during this 45-day comment period, and then a little bit of what the next steps are in this process. So San Luis Obispo is actually on the northern terminus. It is the northernmost terminus of the Pacific Surfliner service. Now, this is the busiest state-supported intercity passenger rail corridor in the country. It operates along the 351-mile Los Angeles, San Diego, San Luis Obispo, or LOSAN for short, rail corridor, which does stretch, as the name suggests, from San Luis Obispo through Santa Barbara, Ventura, LA, and Orange counties before finally terminating in downtown San Diego. Now, the corridor is also shared with two other freight and also passenger operators. It is used by Union Pacific Railroad on the northern portion and the BNSF Railway on the southern, as well as Metrolink and Coaster commuter services there. The proposed project site, which is the rightmost image there, is located south of the current Amtrak station in San Luis Obispo and just south of the Railroad Museum, and is located entirely on Union Pacific owned right-of-way. Jumped ahead there, I apologize. So the site plan presented on this slide presents the configuration of the proposed facility at its full build-out configuration. This plan highlights several key features and functions of the facility that will ultimately be designed and constructed. And these include a wheel truing facility. That's where we make sure that the wheel profiles are to standards and the trains can stay on the track very easily. It includes fueling facilities, backup generators, washing facility, as well as offices for maintenance and operations staff there. It also includes, as is highlighted here in the southern portion, some level of a roundhouse protection zone. There's a lot of history in this region, as I know you're all well aware of, and we want to make sure that we can preserve that century or more of railroad history to the extent that we can by preserving elements of the old roundhouse foundation that are still there and that can still continue to be enjoyed by the public. That would be utilizing the landscape buffer and bikeway that is being proposed as well as part of this. I should say, actually, it's also important to highlight that the facility will be really designed to be adaptable as well to new technology. The state of California has mandated that the passenger services, passenger trains must be zero emission by 2035. And so in collaboration with not just the state, but other passenger operators in the state, we're looking into new zero emission locomotives and train technologies that will ultimately be serviced here as well. In addition to the railroad related features that I presented in the previous slide, there are also several non-railroad proposed features to the project, which include really a pedestrian circulation improvement, such as a Class 1 bike path on the west side of the facility, and preservation to the extent possible that we can of future pedestrian crossings of the railroad. This project does not include specifically the design or construction of any crossing of the railroad tracks, but we will seek to not only preserve the ability to do so in the future, but also continue to work with the city and Union Pacific on solutions going forward there to ensure that there are safe crossings of the railroad going forward there. As kind of indicated earlier in mentioning a full build out, the project will be constructed in phases that are consistent with the overall passenger rail service growth needs for the corridor and region. The first phase, which is really highlighted in the yellow and green here, focuses on the elements that we'll need in the near future. This is the ability to store 2 train sets to be able to service those train sets overnight and perform all necessary Federal Railroad Administration inspections and safety checks there before the trains head out the next day. The first phase will include the landscape buffer, as well as the Class 1 bike path, as well as the grading and basically roadway access necessary and some minor and smaller buildings and shelters needed to at least accommodate some of the train crews and parts and supplies that will be needed just to maintain the service or maintain the trains for regular service overnight there. Later phases will include the remainder actually of the landscape buffer. The first phase will include the northern portion of the landscape buffer, where if you can see my cursor here includes the area in green. Later phases will complete the landscape buffer to the south, will include the wash rack, additional storage tracks, and more permanent buildings and structures going forward. So this slide is really to just summarize, the EIR itself and what it is. And, the California Environmental Equality Act, or CEQA, is really the state's primary environmental protection law. CEQA does require the public agencies to disclose any environmental or potential environmental impacts to projects that may have a physical effect on the environment. So what we're doing here in the development of an EIR is developing an informational document that'll be used to inform the public and decision makers by presenting a project's effect on the environment, potential mitigation measures, and feasible project alternatives. And before an EIR can really be approved, it must be certified by a governing board, which in this case would be the Lausanne Agency Board of Directors. So the development and approval of an EIR has a defined process within CEQA. It begins with the notice of preparation, which was published last February and followed by a public scoping meeting to this commission and the public in March, on March 10th, I believe it was. A series of technical studies are then performed and prepared that feed into the draft EIR. The draft EIR must then be released for a 45-day public comment period following the issuance of a notice of completion or public notice of availability. And this is the phase of the process that we're in currently. Once the 45-day public comment period concludes, comments will be reviewed and addressed and incorporated into the final EIR. And to respond also to Chair Jorgensen, your comment earlier, we have received so far the comments that have come in the last couple of days on the draft EIR, and we'll be looking at those before finalizing the EIR as well. Once the final EIR is developed, we'll then be presented to the Lausanne Board of Directors for certification and approval, after which a notice of determination will be filed with the state completing the EIR process. This EIR focused on several topics for analysis in order to determine potential issues with the project that could present a physical impact to the environment or surrounding area. And to provide a bit more information on the issues analyzed as part of this project, I want to turn it over to our environmental consultant, Tim Ganibus. I'm hoping that you were given access to speak and present right now.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you, James. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
A nod? Okay, thank you. Good evening, Chairman Jorgensen and members of the commission. Tim Ganibus with HDR. We're the environmental consultant to the Lausanne Agency, so we are responsible for preparation of the CEQA documentation for this project. In this case, an environmental impact report. So this slide here just provides a summary of the issues that were analyzed in the draft EIR and where they landed with respect to conclusions. So the column on the left, we've identified several issue areas: air quality, biology, cultural, geology and soils, hazmat, noise, and tribal cultural resources, where we have found impacts, but have proposed mitigation measures that would reduce those impacts to a level of less than significant. And then on the other category is a handful of environmental issue areas that we found to be less than significant with no mitigation required. And as you can see, listed out here: aesthetics, energy, greenhouse gas emissions, hydrology and water quality, land use and planning, transportation, and then utilities and service systems. It's important to note that no significant unavoidable or unmitigated impacts were identified in the draft EIR. That's usually a technical CEQA requirement to prepare an EIR in the first place. But we've found that with the mitigation measures proposed, we're able to reduce all impacts to a level less than significant. So next slide. Just wanted to highlight a few of the key issue areas, and I think from our standpoint, we call them key mainly because in the scoping process, scoping meeting, and NOP review period, we did get comments related to these issue areas. So just wanted to provide a summary of some findings here for a few minutes. With respect to air quality, the impacts are just related to construction activities. No long-term air quality impacts were identified. However, we did receive a comment letter from the County Air Pollution Control District that identified both valley fever and actually naturally occurring asbestos as potential of air quality issues that needed further examination. So we took those comments, prepared a very detailed air quality technical report, and looked at those issues, both because the county does have some level of valley fever, which is associated with dust and inhaling dust, and mostly centered around construction workers. We've prescribed mitigation to address that impact. Also, with respect to naturally occurring asbestos, there's some kind of aggregate maps that are produced that, if you land in this zone, you may have this condition. The site does land in the zone. So we've prescribed mitigation that would require a little bit further investigation into that, whether we actually are in an area that has those types of materials. Again, they're naturally occurring, so they would be associated with soils or geologic conditions. And then if so, a plan would be in place to address that concern. The next area of concern or comment from the public was with respect to noise. And as you would expect with a construction project, there will be an increase in noise levels during the construction phase. So there are mitigation measures prescribed in the EIR to address the short-term construction. We have also, and those include just practices during construction that can help reduce noise during the day, and also community notification so that the surrounding residents and so on are aware that this project is going to be making some noise for a period of time. Once in place, though, there is, as Mr. Campbell explained, there's two phases to this project, and we've looked at both phases. So kind of the worst case build out, if you will, of the project, making sure that we've captured the full analysis. So under phase 2, there are some uses on site that would produce noise where we've identified impacts to some of the closer residential units, both on the east and west side of the tracks. We are proposing and have identified a operational restriction component, which basically provides a shielding effect to surrounding sensitive uses with respect to noise that when in place would mitigate the impact to less than significant level. Next slide, James.
Actually, I just wanted to elaborate really quickly on your comment there, summary, Tim, on the noise mitigation. And I was remiss for not mentioning it earlier. As part of just the operational restrictions and the operating plan, even today, with the diesel-powered locomotives and the Tier 4 locomotives that we have, it's common practice each night to shut those locomotives down, to hook them up to ground power within about 15 or so minutes of them arriving into the yard. And that would be also part of the operating plan, is once they're actually in the yard, tied down for the night, and all safety checks have been done, that those locomotives would be hooked up to electrical ground power and shut down. So that way you don't have idling locomotives and air quality issues throughout the night there until the train's ready to leave the next day. So I just wanted to make that clarification also.
Okay, then just a couple more areas with respect to this presentation that we wanted to address. And the next one is hazards and hazardous materials. We do know that the site does have some contamination of soils, so highly cognizant of that, and that potential impact related to disturbance of the soils is addressed in the EIR, and appropriate mitigation is again applied. And then also the facility would be using to some degree solvents and other potentially hazardous materials. So in order to make sure that there isn't any impacts to any adjacent areas, we've required that a hazardous materials plan be in place and implemented, so that everything is handled accordingly and according to federal, state, and local regulations and with good practices. And then the last category is with respect to cultural resources, and specifically historical resources. And I think we're all very well aware of this project site's location. Dates back to the 1880s in terms of a use as a rail yard, and it's has been demolished to some degree. There are just a few pieces left, including what's referred to as the roundhouse foundation. That's something that's very visible. Just, if you went out to the site, you could see it. And it's it's considered an important historic resource. The design of the project, we were able to be proactive and provide input as to the value of that resource. And as part of the site plan for the project, is to preserve the roundhouse foundation that's visible. So that's where you see the roundhouse protection zone. So that would be preserving that in place, and then also developing some interpretive signage and other features that would be available to the community or somebody that's using the bike trail, whatever, that could stop, and you would see interpretive signage by the protection zone, and you can learn more about the history of the roundhouse and the railroad in this area over the past century. So that involves some public outreach and an educational display. So those are the key mitigations. And if I think I can just hand it back over to James, and of course, if you have any questions, be happy to answer them.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tim, for that. Moving on, just as I wrap up the presentation here, I really wanted to talk about also that CEQA also requires a reasonable range of alternatives to be evaluated. So this has not been the only alternative that is included in the EIR. So there were other alternatives that were actually looked at. I mean, CEQA itself requires, like I said, a reasonable range, and it's intended to address impacts to kind of see if there's other options for meeting the general project objective there. Other alternatives that were looked at to the proposed project that's addressed in the draft EIR is really a no build. So what happens and what does it look like if we're not able or we don't construct the project? An expansion of the existing facility and a couple of other alternate locations, both within and outside of the city of San Luis Obispo are included in the EIR there. So the next steps is as I mentioned before, we're in the 45-day public comment period for the draft EIR. This does end December 20th. After which the final EIR will be prepared and comments will be addressed that we have received prior to the December 20th deadline there. And then early next year at one of our regular board meetings, this will be presented to the Lausanne Board of Directors for their consideration and approval. So for those who haven't already and still would like to, like I said, the comment period is still open until 5 p.m. on December 20th this year. There are a couple of ways to submit comments. Written comments can be sent to myself at the Lausanne Rail Corridor Agency, which is located at 600 South Main Street in the city of Orange, California. It can also be sent to the email address for the project as far as capitalprojects@lausanne.org. And just please include in the subject line the Central Coast Labor Facility or CCLF so that we know that it is specific to this project. And that actually concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions or comments from the commissioners there and the public.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, do you have questions? Starting with Mr. Campbell. You may have to speak up because I can't see all of you at one time here.
I have a question.
Steve, it sounds like.
Yes, that's me.
Hi, Steve.
Thank you, Chairman Jorgensen. My question is about the noise. Right now, there's an existing facility there. When the project is complete after construction, will the noise be more than existing, less than existing, or about the same?
The level of noise per train should not be much of anything louder than what's currently there. We are designing it as a larger facility to accommodate additional trains than what the current one can. So by just that nature, it will likely have additional noise impacts. But I will actually defer to my environmental consultant on the specifics there. But yeah, they're.
I'll go ahead, James, if you don't mind. Just to, so the trains in and of itself were not found to be significant with some operational methods that would be applied. And James summarized some of those earlier. The important thing is that there's power on the ground at this facility, so the engines would hook up to those essentially within 15 minutes. And once they do that, they're quiet. So you have a very similar condition as you do today with respect to an individual train pass and noise level. It's just that you're going to have 2 more or 3 more in the future. Where the impact results, where we've asked, where we've are proposing mitigation is with respect to some of the operations that would be on the site in the maintenance facility itself. And then those are in the second phase of the project. But what it is we've designed an operational way that the trains can sit overnight, or when they're on the site, I should just say, so that they act as a noise barrier between the residential areas to the east and west. And, we've modeled that noise and found that that would be an effective way of reducing those impacts to less than significant level.
Thank you. I
Thank you,
appreciate the
Tim.
answer.
Yeah. So, and as Tim mentioned, as far as the phased approach, in the first phase, the answer would be there's not going to be much difference at all from what we currently see. It really will come in the later phases as far as some of the additional functions and functionality that we'll be having at this facility that we don't currently have in the one that's out there right now.
Other questions or commissioner questions of the Los Angeles?
This is
Yes, Hema.
Hema Dandekar. It's a follow-up question on the noise. I was happy to hear about the switch to electrical when the train becomes stable and at a standstill within 15 minutes. When we talked to you last time, there was some discussion, I believe, about the construction of the buildings themselves, where the maintenance was going to happen, and whether there were opportunities for both aesthetic fit, which HDR has said is insignificant, but also noise attenuation into the facilities, designing noise attenuation. And I'm sorry if this was addressed in the IR. I didn't see it, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure, Commissioner Dandekar. Yeah, in the build out in the later phases there, when we will have the more permanent structures and some of the additional structures that are constructed, like the wash facility and the wheel chewing facility, the buildings themselves are being positioned what could be considered the administrative buildings. So those where people will actually be working in those buildings will serve themselves as some of that barrier right there, because they will be positioned between the Western residences and businesses and the wash facility, which can be noisy when the trains are going through, but it's not all the time. You're only looking at when the trains are passing through that you would have the noise. There will also be sidewalls to the extent we can put them on, and it still allow for water drainage in there, but there will be sidewalls on the wash rack. And Tim can correct me if I'm wrong on this in my memory, but I believe we assumed an enclosed wheel chewing facility that will also serve to minimize any noise that may be associated with that function. And it's also important to note that the wheel chewing function itself is not a regular need. So this would be done on an as needed basis fairly infrequently, just to make sure that the wheel profiles themselves meet federal code for actually operating on the main line there. It just, if they're worn down enough, they can be recut a certain number of times to make sure that their profile still maintains the appropriate look.
Right. Yeah, I did notice the buffer of the administrative offices between the washing facilities and the neighborhood. We have quite a bit of housing that's come out new at that edge. And so it is going to be long-term concern for the community that's moved in there.
Yeah, the wash rack, the plan right now is the wash rack would not be constructed without the administrative buildings going in. So that way you won't have a period of time where you have the wash rack and no physical buffer there.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Chair Jorgensen?
Yes, Mike.
I will have a number of questions and comments, but I think I'll save them for after public comment.
Yeah, I was thinking of doing the same. Okay, good. Why don't we then, I don't see anyone else. I'm sorry, I can't always see you. Commissioners, don't be bashful speaking up. Okay, good. Well, let's move to public comment. Kevin, can you encourage people to raise their hands and virtually, and so that we can hear from them?
Sure. I've just shared my screen that gives the instructions for making public comment on this item. We have one hand up so far, Pete Rogers. I'm going to go ahead and promote you to a panelist, Pete. You'll have to accept that, and then you'll be able to turn your audio and video on to share with the commissioners, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Good to see you all. I'm Pete Rogers. I'm the Executive Director of the San Luis Obispo Council of Governments. And if you haven't heard of us, where you been? Because we're the mobility people. You know, we're highways, streets, roads, transit, the rideshare program, bicycling throughout the county. We're essentially a local agency, but we're a regional agency, and we're your connection to state and federal dollars. And we strongly support this project. This has huge statewide significance. It really puts San Luis Obispo on the map in terms of a rail destination. You may not know that, you know, at SlowCog here, we have organized the Central Coast of California for better passenger rail services since 1990. We pulled together the counties of LA to San Jose a couple times a year with elected officials and staff to improve rail services. We're now working closely with the Caltrans Division of Rail to build a new passenger platform in King City. Why King City, you might ask? It's not even in our county, because we need to demonstrate better rail services and patronage in order to justify additional train services for the Central Coast. We need to, you know, build this ridership. The Coast Starlight would stop there initially until we can get a state-supported train on the corridor. San Luis Obispo is really considered an endpoint station since it takes 5 to 6 hours to get to LA or the Bay Area. And, you know, we're dedicated to conventional rail services. 30 years ago, we were asked if we wanted to be on the high-speed rail line. We said, no, thanks. We don't want a high-speed rail train speeding through here, but this is a good green way to move forward. We strongly support the bike path on the west side of the facility and the future grade separations and planning for them at Francis and Roundhouse. We recognize that there will be a need for mitigation of noise, access, air quality, et cetera. And we pledge that SlowCog will be a good local partner here with the city and LoSan moving this project forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next speaker is listed. It's either Myron Emerine or Leah Brooks. I'm going to promote you to a panelist, and you'll be able to introduce yourself to the commission. Leah or
Hi. Okay, can you hear me? This is Leah Brooks.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I live about a half mile from the project site. And I submitted some questions, but in case they weren't going to be answered. One question I had is the entire 0.84 mile trail going to be constructed during phase 1? Because the draft EIR kind of included it with landscaping. So I wasn't sure if the whole trail would be built or if it was going to be mixed up with phased in landscaping. And the other has to do with how will the railroad crossings be initiated? And is it Union Pacific that's responsible for monitoring? There's a lot of crossings of the railroad track right now between Jennifer Street Bridge and Orchid, and I think that is just going to continue to increase. And there really is a need for crossings. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah.
The next speaker will be Helene Finger. Helene, I'm going to promote you to a panelist now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent. Does my video pop up or no?
It did for a minute.
Okay. Well, I will just go ahead and speak. I am very excited about this project and really enjoy utilizing a train for commuting. In fact, I was on it just a couple weeks ago, heading down to Southern California. And my comment is about the EIR is really focused on identifying impacts and appropriate mitigations. And I did submit a letter along these lines, and I just wanted to highlight that it does state in the EIR that it's going to contribute to a barrier that separates pedestrians and bicyclists at a place where currently these folks are crossing the tracks. And the solution proposed is to put a fence up, which I think a much better solution would be to acknowledge the fact that it is creating a barrier that needs to be mitigated. And a not very expensive mitigation would be an at-grade crossing at Francis Street. So I strongly encourage that to be added, and the details of how to do that is in the letter I submitted. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. We've received your letter, as we have Leah Brooks' letter. Kevin, are there other public comments?
This time, there's no other hands up. Oh, there we go. We've got another one.
Good.
Kaizen Sugano, I will be promoting you to a panelist now. And please introduce your name, yourself, and pronounce your name properly, as I'm sure I did not. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Hi, I'm Kaizen Sugano, and I live at 2181 Florence, so close to the projected project. I apologize, I'm coming sort of new to the thing. I must have missed the March 10th postcard and just caught up with this. I have multiple questions, and, you know, again, I'll ask a couple, and then, you know, maybe some, depending on the way that you guys are sensing my questions, maybe then I should, you know, contact Mr. Campbell or whatever else. I guess one of my questions is the alternatives. What can I hear a little bit more about the alternatives? I guess my point right now is, yeah, I support rail. I support the Greenpeace part of that. I'm just curious as to, yes, there's been a lot of residential areas built up since maybe that piece of land was last used. And so I'm curious as to what the alternatives were like and why perhaps they were not. The present spot is our best spot for that.
Thank you for that. And let me just mention that you're very welcome to submit a letter to raise the questions you've raised and other questions. I think Mr. Campbell gave us a date, which I'm blanking on right this very second, but later in December, there's still time to.
Yeah, December 20th is what I heard.
It's not a bad idea. They absolutely will be responding in writing to your comments. So
thank you.
That's never a bad idea. Thank you for speaking. Kevin, anybody else?
We have no other hands at this moment. Let's give everybody just a few seconds. As a last reminder, you need to raise your hand, and if you'd like to speak, and then I can promote you to a panelist to speak. We'll just give you a few more seconds. All right, Chair Jorgensen, seeing none, back to you.
Good. So I'll close the public hearing section of this larger public hearing and turn it back to commissioners for discussion or questions directed to the Lausanne staff. Mike, you had some questions. You want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Jorgensen. My first question is to staff. And I was wondering how the Planning Commission's comments tonight are going to be handled. Are the Planning Commission's comments going to be incorporated into staff's letter to Losan on the EIR, or are they simply being taken down by the Losan staff tonight and then they'll be addressed in the final EIR?
I think the best way to answer that there could be a little bit of both. I think that there's all of the comments from the public and the commission are going to be considered by HDR, the environmental consultants in Losan. I think also as staff hears comments from the public and the commission, as we consider the city staff letter, there may be some ideas and concerns raised. If they haven't already been looked at by staff, we may look at those comments and also include comments to that effect in the city staff letter as well, if warranted.
Okay, that sounds good. So if you don't mind, Chair Jorgensen, I have a number of things I'd like to just list instead of getting into a conversation with the Losan staff. Maybe it would be most efficient just to list them.
Sounds
And
like a good
if they want to answer, they can answer now. Otherwise, I assume the questions would be answered in the final EIR. So I'll just go ahead and start. But I'll start on a lighter note. This might be of interest to the new commissioner, Commissioner Francis. I don't know if anybody else noticed, but there are a number of streets that border this project, and two of them are Emily and Francis. That are right next to this project site. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Anyway, I'll start with hazardous materials. And there is a mitigation measure called HAZ1 to prepare a construction hazardous management or materials management plan. And it wasn't clear to me whether that mitigation measure applied also to daily operations as well as construction. So I think that should be clarified in the EIR. I couldn't tell from what was in the mitigation measure whether it addressed the operation of the site after it's built. And then I have a couple of items having to do with noise, and this is noise from operations, not from construction. There's a mitigation measure called NV-3, and it has to do with train movements, and the staff tonight alluded to this, and it has to do with the trains being parked in certain areas so they block the noise from other trains that would come and park later or be serviced later. And anyway, as far as I could tell, that mitigation measure applies to the later phases of the project, not the first phase. And so I'm wondering, wouldn't there be significant impacts from noise from the first phase of operations because you don't have those other additional trains there to block the noise from the first phase operation? So that's one question. And then the second has to do with noise from the wash track. And the way I understood it, the wash track is the westernmost track where the washing operations will take place. So the question that I didn't see addressed in the EIR is how will noise from the wash track to the west be mitigated? You've got you've got several multifamily buildings. Two of them were pointed out in the EIR as being subject to noise impacts. One is an 8-unit building and the other is a 21-unit building. They're numbered R-170 and R-176. So the question is, how will noise be mitigated to those buildings from the wash track, which is the westernmost track, since there won't be any trains parked west of that wash track to block the noise? I understand the buildings that are proposed may block some of the noise, but this wasn't explained in the EIR, so I think that should be. And with regard to transportation, I had two concerns about conclusions that the EIR made, and I didn't see any explanation in the EIR, any basis for these conclusions. The conclusion was that the planned grade separated crossing at Roundhouse which would connect Roundhouse to Bishop on the other side of the tracks, would not, that wouldn't be precluded by the proposed project. And I didn't see any basis in the EIR for making that conclusion. I didn't see a conceptual design or any discussion about the feasibility of doing that grade separated crossing. And I'm not an engineer, but just looking at the short distance between the end of Roundhouse and that very first proposed track, I don't see how you can get a road and bike path and pedestrian path elevated above that track in a very short distance. So I think the EIR should say a little bit more about the basis for concluding that the project does not preclude the crossing. Same goes for the proposed crossing at Francis Avenue. Can that be accomplished with the proposed security fencing? And I didn't understand exactly how that would happen, because the site is supposed to be fenced, and yet there's a discussion about grade crossing at Francis. I think it's an at-grade crossing at Francis. So the question is, how does the project not preclude that future crossing at Francis? And then finally, on consistency with plans, we discussed this back in March. I think a couple of commissioners, including myself, were wanting to see some sort of design for the buildings. I looked through the EIR, I did not see a design. I did not see even a conceptual design of any of the buildings. So I'm not sure how you can conclude in the EIR that the project will be consistent with the railroad district plan, for example, if we don't even have designs for the buildings or the lighting. So I think that could use some more discussion in the EIR. How can you have, how will it be consistent? How will the project be consistent with the railroad district plan, for example? And those are my comments and questions. If the Losan staff wishes to respond to any of that tonight, that's great. If not, I just, hopefully they'll be addressed in the final EIR. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, since that was a fairly lengthy list, maybe I could ask Mr. Campbell if he or any of the other staff would wish to comment on any of those issues that were raised.
Just a couple, but as was mentioned before, we appreciate these being incorporated into the city's letter, so that way they can be actually documented and incorporated into the EIR, so we can actually address them appropriately there too. And the couple that I feel that the easiest to address as far as the noise mitigation associated with phase one, with you know, the question that you had, Commissioner Wolkin, is that there's only two trains that will be assumed as part of phase one, or two tracks to support two trains. Those tracks will be stub ended. So once a train comes into that particular track, it does its safety checks, plugged in, and is shut down within 15 minutes. There is no movement within the yard once it actually gets into the track. And the same thing with the second train, because of only one more track left. So the mitigation or the noise, I should say, impacts would be no different than what you would see in the current facility right now, where it's a simple move in, plug in, and shut down there. And that's why, but it's not as, it wasn't mentioned as phase one, but I understand it needs to be clearer in how it's described. So I'll work with the team to make sure that that is made much more clear in the final EIR. And the rest we'll make sure that we actually address as well, and have some response to as part of the formal process. I think we got most of it, but I need to make sure we check before I make any comments and responses there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that response. Can I, Mr. Chair Jorgensen, can I ask if the city staff got all of my comments, or should we discuss, talk later if you need any details?
Commissioner Wilkin, I have all of your comments. We have the video, which we'll be going back to one way or another. We're going to make sure the comments are addressed. And I will just say generally, some of the comments you've raised are things that staff are already looking into. So,
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Are there questions from other commissioners? While you're thinking, let me ask about at-grade crossings. I'm curious if in the 351 miles of that LoSAN oversees for rail there, are there other at-grade crossings? Are they frequent? How many are there, and how's that working out?
Extensive, and throughout the entire corridor, there are hundreds. And with the goal of grade separating most of them. Some are, I am unmuted, right? Okay.
Yes, you are unmuted.
I figured someone probably would have said something there, but Chair Jorgensen, some need to be addressed more than others, where those that we have the busiest ones, not surprisingly, are in Los Angeles, Orange, or San Diego counties. So mainly on the southern end of the corridor. We do tend to have the occasional incident on. It's why on heavily utilized rail corridor, traditionally, both the railroad, the host railroad, and the Public Utilities Commission don't like new at-grade crossings. Because of that, they're trying to limit the potential interaction, so to speak, between trains and either vehicles or pedestrians. But it has been made very clear to us from at least the city, Brian and Michael Codron, the importance of making sure that there is the ability to connect across the tracks safely. So we are trying within the framework of what our funding allows and what our scope of work is to not preclude, as I mentioned before, and allow to the extent we can the possibility of constructing some sort of crossing across the tracks as part of this project there. And as I mentioned in my presentation, even if it's not in this particular scope and of this particular project for design and construction, the commitment we've given, the city, SLOCOG, who is our San Luis Obispo County member agency. Mr. Rogers forgot to mention that SLOCOG is on our board of directors, and represented by Fred Strong and Andy Pease. And we're a commitment to continue working with them and the Union Pacific Railroad to find a solution for allowing those crossings safely going forward there. But yes, we do have a lot of at-grade crossings on a 351-mile corridor, which get much more frequent the further south you get.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine the issues, but we certainly would absolutely appreciate your best efforts to find a way to get there. It's really important to us. Yeah. Are there other commission comments at this point or questions? Well, we may have wrapped this up. We don't have since this is not the city's EIR, we don't have a recommendation of the city council or any such thing. This is a real public service on the part of LoSAN to come up here and bring us into the middle of it. We really appreciate it. It's someone who's and whose family has taken at least a dozen trips from here to San Diego and vice versa. This is a really important thing for us, I think, and that it speaks well of the possible future of more rail up and down the coast. Seems like a great thing to be working on. So thank you for coming up here and making this presentation.
You're welcome,
Good
and
luck
thank
moving
you.
forward.
Thank you to all the commissioners and the city for allowing us to do this. It's our pleasure, and we look forward to continue to work with each of you and the staff of the city, not just on this project, but others in the future. We want to make sure that it's a partnership going forward.
That sounds very good. Mr.
Okay.
Cochran, do you want to?
I'm sorry, I should have spoken earlier.
Uh-oh.
This is Hema Dandekar. The EIR is really quite detailed in its rendition of the historic significance of the area, particularly those parts, the roundhouse and so on. And you referred to Bob Pavlik's studies of their significance. It wasn't terrible. I know that this area is now going to be designated as a historic resource. And I hope that the Lausanne will invest resources in doing a real robust strategy, not just with the interpretive science. And there are many ways to do interpretation, and I hope resources will be substantial, because there really is quite a trove of information about what the roundhouse looked like, how it functioned. There's documentation about sort of the ebb and flow of people through the area. And I hope that some of that can be captured. The Railroad Museum tries to do some of that, but the roundhouse is really a focal point for pointing out what went on in this place.
We understand.
I think the EIR has done a very good description of its importance. I just hope there's a significant follow-up in what actually gets built and what money is put into the interpretive side of things.
Mr. Jorgensen and
Yes.
Mr. Campbell, this is Deputy Clerk Christian. I just wanted to request that Mr. Campbell perhaps repeat the date and the date for final comments and where to send those comments, so that any public might be able to get that if they didn't get it earlier.
Yes, of course. So the deadline is 5:00 p.m. on December 20th, 2021. And a couple of ways to submit comments. One is to a written letter through the Postal Service addressed to myself, James Campbell, Operations Officer for the Lausanne Rail Quarter Agency, and it could be sent to 600 South Main Street in the city of Orange, California. That's a zip code of 92863. People can also, who want to make comments, can also send an email to capitalprojects@lausanne.org, and just put in the subject line Central Coast Layover Facility or CCLF, just so we know that it's related to this project.
And Chair Jorgensen, I just
Yes.
thank you. I just wanted to also thank Lausanne and SLOCOG for the engagement. I think it's very helpful, and appreciate the Planning Commission creating this forum for members of the public. Obviously, this presentation will be available on demand to members of the community who weren't able to participate tonight. So they'll be able to see the presentation and then contact Lausanne with any comments that they might have. And then, city staff is also evaluating the EIR and is going to provide comments. And so we will be sure to provide the Planning Commission with any input that city staff ends up forwarding over to Lausanne.
No, thank you, Michael. That's important. Thank you. Well, good. Then I think we'll close this item and we'll move to the next item, 6A, which is a presentation on Senate Bill 9. Who's going to take the lead on this?
I'm gonna start.
Okay.
And so I'll start just by introducing myself again. I'm Michael Codron, Director of Community Development. And I'm joined by Theresa Mcclish, who is the city's Housing Policy and Programs Manager, also in the Community Development Department. I'm gonna provide some high-level comments as an introduction, and then turn it over to Theresa to give the presentation and to talk about some more details. But first off, if anybody's unaware of what SB 9 is, this is a new state law that allows property owners to build at least 2 primary residences on their single-family zoned owner-occupied properties, and also gives property owners the ability to split those lots, to split their property into 2 under certain circumstances. So ultimately, what we're here to discuss, or what SB 9 creates, is an opportunity to discuss infill development and how our city regulates the development of new homes in existing neighborhoods. This has generated a lot of input. I want to recognize that input, let everybody know that we appreciate it. We're reading everything that comes in, and we're listening to those concerns. We're watching what other communities are doing, and we're going to be continuing to watch and learn, and ultimately bring forward recommendations for action on this topic in a thoughtful and strategic way. A lot of the input that we've received has been asking the city to do something about SB 9 because there are concerns that drastic changes to the pattern of development in our neighborhoods will reduce residents' quality of life and their ability to enjoy their properties. So with that respect, I am happy to report that last night the City Council passed into law, will go into effect in 30 days, new objective design standards. And those objective design standards apply to any residential project in the city that is allowed by right, that is allowed without discretionary review, such as review by the Planning Commission. And the objective design standards approved by the City Council cover a wide range of important factors relative to compatibility of a new building being inserted into an existing neighborhood. So they cover building details, materials, roof designs. They prevent rooftop decks, for example. They address massing and articulation of new buildings, privacy and overlook, and also landscaping. And as it happens, the city's housing element, which was adopted in November 2020, and it's since been certified by the state of California. The housing element includes a program that directed us to complete that work on objective design standards. And that's because as a city, we've actually enabled ourselves other types of housing projects to be developed by right. So there are a number of different types of housing projects that can be processed in the city just by getting a building permit. And those are programs that have been implemented consistent with the city's affordable housing objectives, as well as our housing production major city goal. So it's exciting. We feel very positive about the fact that objective design standards are now in place because they do apply to SB 9 development. And I'll just highlight that in that regard, the city of SLO is in the top tier of jurisdictions in the state with respect to how we process by right projects with our objective design standards. So Theresa is going to get into the details of SB 9, but I wanted to provide some of my big takeaways in our evaluation so far. And one of those is that the new law, the state law that allows for this additional development is really an owner-occupied property benefit. It's not designed for developers or other speculators. There are limitations on any property that has been occupied by a tenant in the last 3 years, and owner occupancy is required for 3 years following project construction. Another big takeaway for me is that the city already permits up to 3 dwelling units per lot with its accessory dwelling unit ordinance. So that would include a primary residence, an accessory dwelling unit, and a junior accessory dwelling unit. And these ADUs are much less expensive to build, and the timeframes for approval are far quicker. So state law requires the city, us as a municipality, our jurisdiction is required to issue permits for new ADUs within 60 days from acceptance of a complete application. So there's a lot of certainty, and there's a quick time frame turnaround if anybody wants to develop an ADU. In addition, ADUs are not subject to impact fees, but homes built under SB 9 are. So we'll get into more of those details in this presentation. But finally, I guess I would say a big takeaway, another big takeaway I'd like to share is the limited applicability of SB 9 in the city of SLO. Recently, a statewide study was published, and it looked at San Luis Obispo among a lot of other, I think all other communities in the state, to determine what the potential for new units is under SB 9, and it identified the potential for 800 new units across the city. And we're working to confirm our initial impressions, but we believe the actual number of units that will be created in our city through SB 9 is likely to be about 25% of that number. So maybe up to 200 units, over a 20-year time period or longer. So in the meantime, city staff is going to seek guidance from the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. They're expected to produce their brochure, their guidance. It'll be an official memo from HCD that'll explain how they intend to, what their interpretation of the law is, which sometimes differs from, sort of a plain language read of how the law is stated. But their interpretation is important because they're the ones that actually enforce compliance. So we're going to be seeking guidance from HCD. We're going to be working on this issue through our current work program as well, which includes an update to the subdivision regulations. We're updating our inclusionary housing ordinance, and we're developing a missing middle housing program. And all three of those efforts give us opportunities to address components of SB 9 if we find that that's best practice and the way to go. So through these efforts, we also expect to be able to implement those best practices, which really will also help ensure that we don't run into enforcement problems from the state. So with that summary, I'd like to ask Theresa to go ahead and provide the detailed presentation, and then we will be available for any questions that the commission might have, and also look forward to public comments. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll turn it over to
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, Chair Jorgensen and members of the Commission. I'm Theresa Mcclish, the Housing and Policy and Programs Manager, and we'll walk you through the Senate bill this evening and highlight some of the areas, again, that Michael mentioned, as well as some other aspects of the bill. So we'll cover some of the eligibility criteria that is embedded in the state statute, including anti-displacement standards, particular criteria for lot splits, objective standards, and certain exclusion areas. And we'll have a brief comparison of Senate Bill 9 provisions versus our existing regulations for accessory dwelling units. And then we'll talk about next steps going forward. So the Senate Bill 9 was passed into law in September, and it does require ministerial approval. This is, again, a very objective criteria. It's no discretionary review of 2 residential units on a parcel within an R1, a single family residential zone, or the subdivision of one lot into two lots within an R1 zone for the development of 2 units on each parcel. It's really important to emphasize that the development must meet certain eligibility criteria. This is criteria embedded in the state statute. And it's also criteria that's existing in city ordinances that is objective. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Since it's requiring ministerial review only, it's not subject to the California Environmental Quality Act, and this law becomes effective January 1st. So looking at the bill in terms of protections that are afforded in the statute for tenant protections and some guardrails concerning investors and speculation that Michael mentioned. A project cannot involve the demolition or alteration of structures if the property contains affordable housing, a deed restricted unit, or housing that's occupied by a tenant within the last 3 years, and some other provisions that are probably less applicable here, but rent controlled housing or housing withdrawn from the rental market in the last 15 years. And that's commonly referred to as Ellis Act, rental tenant evictions. So when we look at our city and we look at our R1 zoning districts and we look at the portion of ownership units versus renters, you can see that it's about evenly split. And we have this analysis here by our GIS department, and that shows that owner occupied units are just a little over half of the lots in the city. And this means that nearly half of the R1 zones or parcels would be subject to those tenant occupied restrictions attached to Senate Bill 9. So looking at some of these objective standards that are included in the bill, and would be simply a checklist for us to use, and we do not need to adopt our own ordinance for our ability to require these requirements in the Senate bill. These include a setback of 4 feet from side and rear lot lines, the inclusion of an off-street parking space of 1 per unit, no short-term rentals less than 30 days. There's that 3-year owner-occupied requirement for the Senate Bill 9 projects when a lot split is approved. And no accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units allowed in conjunction with a Senate Bill 9 parcel split. And in addition to the objective standards that are currently available and required by state statute, we do have our city standards that are applicable to Senate Bill 9 projects. These are our standards, objective standards in our zoning ordinance, objective design standards that Michael mentioned were just adopted, and our subdivision standards. But it's important to note as all these standards can be applied to SB 9 project as long as the standards do not physically preclude the construction of 2 units on either resulting parcels of 800 square feet in floor area. And I will emphasize again that we have a considerable leg up on applying design criteria to Senate Bill 9 projects because of the adoption last night at City Council of our ordinance for objective design standards. These will become effective January 5th and will be used to evaluate Senate Bill 9 projects. Moving on to some of the exclusion areas, there's language in the bill concerning fire hazard areas. And you can see here where we've mapped our very high fire hazard zones where Senate Bill 9 projects would not be allowed. And we've been receiving lots of questions about this. Why can't we apply, you know, our very high fire hazard zones and just exclude large segments of our R1 districts? And you can see that there's really no overlap here, very minimal overlap of these areas in conjunction with our R1 zones, similarly with our high fire hazard zones as well. And even when there may be some overlap with a high fire hazard zone, mitigation measures can be assessed, and if appropriately mitigated, the Senate Bill 9 project can proceed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some caveats there. But moving on to some other exclusions built into the bill, these include prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance, any wetlands, lands within the very high fire hazard severity zones. And again, as I mentioned, hazardous waste sites, sites within earthquake fault zones. We do have an earthquake fault zone adjacent to the city, but not overlying any R1 parcels. And there's more, land within the 100-year floodplain or floodway unless mitigated. The city does have requirements that any building must meet our drainage design manual and our floodplain ordinances. These would apply to any Senate Bill 9 projects. Land identified for conservation under a natural community conservation plan or easement. Habitat for protected species, sites located within a historic landmark district or a site that has a historic property landmark under local or state law. And this is interesting because this is, it does include a large area of the city, a sizable area of the city. However, this district, our historic district, does not overlie R1 parcels. So would not necessarily exclude properties that are able to develop under Senate Bill 9. The parcel cannot have been created from a previous lot split as provided by the bill. And this is, again, getting at that protection against investor speculation. And then here's a very important provision in the bill. Cities have the authority to deny projects that are a threat to public health and safety. And this is under a specific provision of the bill that gives authority to our chief building official to deny projects that can be foreseen to have any threat to public health and safety based on a preponderance of evidence, and findings would have to be made for that, but it is available for any areas, R1 areas of the city that are where a SB 9 development project or parcel split is applied for. In those, that provision is available to us day one by state statute. So Michael mentioned that we are trying to keep an eye on what's going on with the rest communities throughout the rest of the state. And there are several communities that are pursuing urgency ordinances, and they're listed on the screen, some of them. We've made some contact with some, and the primary reason appears to be they don't have those objective design criteria robust enough in their ordinances, and they want to put them in place prior to the bill becoming effective. So we are fortunate to have our objective design standards in place, as well as our other objective standards that can be applied to these projects as they come in after January 1st. And taking a look at what property owners may be looking at as they're evaluating what might be good for their property in terms of pursuing a project under our existing accessory dwelling unit law, or as opposed to the Senate Bill 9 provisions. And here's where we think that the feasibility and the financial benefit may lie within our existing ADU laws. There's no owner occupancy requirement for ADUs. There's no restrictions for existing structures, whereas there are with Senate Bill 9 for those that are tenant occupied. There's no impact fees in comparison. ADUs are exempt from our objective design standards, where certainly SB 9 projects are not. And parking requirements, none for ADUs, and space is required for an SB 9 unit. And then looking forward at next steps, as Michael mentioned, as housing is a major city goal in our financial plan, and we have lots of work programs underway. Two of them are an update of the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance, well on its way, and an update to our subdivision regulations. And these are these are two work products that are we are working on and looking at through an SB 9 lens. So if there's concerns about some of the SB 9 projects that could be addressed in our subdivision regulations, any concerns, for example, with the lot split provision, we can holistically look at it through these work efforts. And then finally, just acknowledging that the city very intentionally inserted policy and programs for missing middle housing in our housing element. And while Senate Bill 9 wasn't the provision we originally envisioned for our missing middle program, it is certainly a component of it now. And we have policies that encourage the development of a variety of missing middle housing types. This is the Senate bill as regulated is not necessarily inconsistent with this policy, and we'll be looking at opportunities going forward in our other work programs to make sure that we have the criteria that's meaningful for our community going forward. And that concludes the presentation. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to present some of the information that we've been looking at to the commission this evening.
Thank you, Theresa. That was very well done. And looks like you've got a full plate for a couple of years, to say the least. And with a lot of your peers as well. My goodness. Are there any commission questions about the presentation right now? We can also wait till after public comment, but there's something that wasn't understood or you wanted to clarify real quickly, this would be a time to do it.
I have a couple of questions, but I'm also happy to wait until after public comment if that's preferable.
Why don't you just jump in and get them in? We'll see what happens.
Okay, great. So I understand that if an ADU already exists, the property becomes ineligible, but with the lot split, if the ADU is located on part of the parcel, is it still potentially an option for a homeowner to then split the lot in two with the ADU on one property, and then the other one would be eligible for the additional part development?
There's probably some potential in that scenario. There's renter protection. So if there's tenants included, then you have to wait those 3 years to mess with the structure, alter or demolish the structure. And the bill contains provisions that you do not add ADUs and SB 9 units where you're doing a lot split under Senate Bill 9 rules.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question, and has to do with the enforcement of owner occupancy in the 3 years after the approval. Would that be something that would, I guess I'm curious, how would that be enforced and what would be the penalties for somebody violating that 3-year owner occupancy rule? And would it have to be the original owner, or could the development and lot split happen, then a sale of the property to a new owner occupant happen?
Right, I think I can maybe address that because historically the city of SLO has had owner occupancy requirements for accessory dwelling units, for example, before the state law changed to prevent us from requiring that. And what we typically do is record an agreement. And so that gives us then the recourse to, pursue, legal measures to correct essentially the breach of the agreement. And in this case, what's required is that the applicant for one of these projects submit an affidavit, like just in order to have a complete application, they have to submit the affidavit to say that their intent is to occupy the property for 3 years. And then, that one of the things that we'll be looking at is the extent to which we can then require covenants or other things to ensure ongoing compliance. But it is the kind of thing that we can track and that and we can follow up if we identify violations, and we have a history of doing that.
Okay, I was curious what the structure of the penalty would be if it was, simply a fine that some developer might see as sort of a slap on the wrist and able to use that as a loophole, or if there was a different type of penalty in place, how that would work.
Well, that would be something. I don't think I have the specific answer in terms of what all legal remedies we might have available to us to enforce, but that's a question we can take away and make sure that we are clear on the response.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Good questions. Anyone else?
Chair Jorgensen, I have one question.
Go ahead.
So I really appreciate the analysis on the ADU versus SB9 eligible unit comparison, and was curious, you mentioned the difference between impact fees. Can you lay out what for the average comparable type units that would look like, to put that in perspective as to, the average SB9 eligible unit, what that would pay versus an ADU? Obviously no impact fees, but other permit fees and of the sort.
The other permit fees wouldn't differ, but not having impact fees is a $40,000 to $50,000 savings. So we're talking about water impact fee, sewer impact fee, transportation impact fee. There's parks and recreation, public safety, general government, all these fees that are, important fees for the city to be able to provide continue to provide the level of service that we do provide to the community in those areas as we grow. Impact fees are an important tool for that. For accessory dwelling units, the law prevents us from applying those fees, and that's not the case with SB9 units. Unless we were to choose to do that. And I would recommend that. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate the clarification.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing anyone else. Kevin, are there public comments?
Chair Jorgensen,
Sorry.
I have a couple of questions for staff.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. So I understood from the presentation and the staff report that the city isn't allowed to impose any requirements that would prevent the development of 2 dwellings of a minimum of 800 square feet. So let me give this example. If in order to develop an 800 square foot second unit on a fairly small lot, let's say that development would have to cover 80% of the site, whereas in the R1 zone, you've got a 40% lot coverage requirement in general. So if I'm correct, the city would have to approve that development under SB9 if it meets all the other requirements?
No, I think in that scenario, you could have a stacked flat, you could have a duplex one unit on top of the other. So it, we still have the ability to enforce our objective standards, and lot coverage is one of those standards that is not implicated in the new legislation. There are some setback reductions that are enabled through the new legislation, but lot coverage is not one of the things that sort of gets an automatic pass. And there are other ways to provide the units in a vertical configuration and a side-by-side configuration that could likely accomplish, the minimum standard of 2 units, at least 800 square feet each, without having to relax a standard like lot coverage. But it's dependent on a case-by-case scenario. So.
Okay, so there, I'm understanding there is some ability to apply a lot coverage standard, but what I'm curious about is I thought this was supposed to be a ministerial approval. So once we get into discussing the design of the project with the applicant, aren't we now trying to apply discretion to the project?
Well, if somebody submits an application through the building permit process that, for instance, shows 50% lot coverage, where 40% lot coverage is the maximum in the code, then we can reject that application.
Oh, we're allowed to do that.
Yep.
Okay.
We reject that application, and then the conversation, I think, ensues from there in terms of, well, how can I as an applicant, we're constantly working with property owners to help them accomplish their goals. So, what we would do is look at what type of development could be accomplished that would be consistent with the city standards in this case.
So if we reject the application, that doesn't violate the SB9 requirement that we can't impose restrictions that prevent the second dwelling unit?
Correct, because it's a checklist analysis. We're not using discretion, actually. We're just implementing the code, and that coverage requirement is part of the code.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Also, the owner occupancy requirement, I understand from the staff presentation, to apply to the second, to a lot split. What about the second unit on an existing lot? Does the owner occupancy requirement apply to that as well?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, it does.
Okay, all right, great. And then finally, I was curious about something I read in the staff report. It talked about a possible limitation on SB9 projects due to homeowner association requirements. And I was curious what kind of HOA requirements could actually supersede state law.
Well, I think about Stone Ridge as the example in our community in terms of a location that might be very difficult to accomplish this. But even in a place like Stone Ridge, perhaps a single family home, could be converted into a duplex within the same footprint, just 2 smaller units. But I'm not sure whether that property owner would be able to get approval from the HOA for such a, for that proposal. And that's not something that the city would necessarily be involved with. So we do not enforce CC&Rs. We don't, we're not agents of homeowners associations. That would be something completely between the property owner and the board of the HOA.
So that would the HOA be in violation of SB9, or doesn't apply to them?
That's right. And I think that, in our analysis, part of our analysis in looking at, we have a lot of townhomes and condominiums in the R1 zone that, technically fit the criteria for SB9 and probably factor into the estimate of some of the units that might be possible, but we, just don't see that happening. For insurance reasons, and for so many reasons, it's complicated to to build anything within an existing condominium project in an HOA. And so we don't see that being much of a source of any units produced through this legislation.
Okay, and finally, is staff inviting comments from the Planning Commission tonight?
Sure.
And would those be forwarded to the City Council? Or is this just strictly a presentation for our information?
It's strictly a presentation for your information, for the community. We've let the community know and let the council know about the presentation. We're going to make the link of the video widely available. So any comments that you make will be shared in that way.
Okay, thank you.
A quick question, Michael. In your presentation, you had a slide showing what appeared to be a duplex.
Yeah.
Did that relate directly to SB 9 or maybe SB 8 or something, because it's already built?
I don't know, Teresa, where that is a nice design duplex though. Where did
Very
that one
nice,
come
that's
from?
for sure. Little bit
No,
of-
I don't exactly know. Our stellar assistant planner, Owen Good, helped with that PowerPoint illustration, and it's a sort of almost fits in with the scenario that that Commissioner Wolken asked about, is like how can some of these fit on a lot, and that's just one example.
So, but we're not necessarily saying a zero line lot split.
That wouldn't be a lot split. That would be just, two homes on a single parcel. If it was a duplex in that configuration, you wouldn't have a property line there.
I see. So that's one of the things permitted by SB 9.
Yep.
Yeah, good. Well, let's go to public comment. Hopefully we've got some. Kevin, can you help us out?
Yeah, absolutely. So at this point, I'm going to just go through the drill again for anybody that's in the attendee audience. If you would like to make a public comment at this point, please raise your hand and I will promote you to a panelist. You'll have 3 minutes to make your comments to the commission. We'll give you, a few more seconds. Chair, just FYI, at this point, we don't have any hands up. All right, seeing none, back to you, Chair Jorgensen.
Okay, well, it's back then. Public hearing aspect is closed. Further comments from anybody or questions? Oh, Steve, it looks like you're right there. But
yeah, I just have one comment. I've been tracking this Senate bill as it was passed and kind of looking at it, reading it. I'd like to just thank staff tonight. I think they did a great job of quickly summarizing it and really coming up with some views I hadn't heard before on the legal and issues on the project and looking at how it affects the city of San Luis Obispo. So I appreciate the analysis and the information. That's my comment.
Amen.
I know it's not a motion, but I second that.
Let me ask Michael, because it seems this is going to be an interesting topic. I'd certainly be interested in knowing, maybe quarterly, maybe on a semi-annual basis, sort of what the production under SB 9 turns out to be. Just maybe it could be folded in, since there's so much work on housing one way or another right now. It might just be an addendum or something if there's some other report to the Planning Commission, just to, I don't think.
Yeah, we're actually just starting the process now of doing our annual report on the general plan. So for 2021, and we'll be coming to the Planning Commission typically, late winter, early spring with that report, and then you forward that on to the City Council. So that's a perfect place to include this information. Obviously, for this annual report, there won't be any on SB 9, but we are tracking ADU development through that report, and we'll probably include, a statement about SB 9, and we'll have a placeholder, so we'll be able to track that going forward. But in terms of, I would say the first year, we'd be happy quarterly to share information about what we're seeing in terms of plans that we've reviewed, plans that we've approved, any, design components that we want to promote. If we think they're good examples. I think if we find that there are any complications or problems, then, that'll be something that we are able to discuss and then work into, our subdivision regulations update, for example. One thing is that our subdivision regulations are relatively permissive right now as it relates to deep lot subdivisions, flag lots, where you have a long driveway to a parcel behind a residence. And, historically in the past, that's a pattern of development that can create some complications in terms of having, new homes occupy backyard spaces and that kind of thing. So, one of the things we've seen other jurisdictions do is require that SB 9 urban lot splits have that the resultant lots both have street frontage. So you have them side by side as opposed to one behind the other. And it's something that we have to evaluate. I mean, that probably isn't the best solution in all cases, but our update to the subdivision regulations then gives us the chance to really consider those kinds of questions more in depth.
And certainly as HCD hands out their guidance, that may also, give us another opportunity to take a look at some of the things we want to insert in our ordinances.
I see several people looking as if they might wish to speak, but nobody's raising a hand. Mike Wilkin, you look.
My hand's up. Thank you. I think.
Sorry, I just can't see it. I haven't. I guess.
I think Commissioner Dandekar wanted to go first.
My hand was up, but it's fine, Mike, if you'd like to go ahead. But I just had a question of clarification. Thank you for the presentation. Staff has made sort of the issue, contextualized it well, I think. I was sort of interested in learning a little bit more about your analysis where you thought that there was limited applicability of SB 9 because you were seeing about Berkeley, the Tanner Center has said, interpreted 800 new units across the city possibly, and you're estimating 200 perhaps over the next 20 years, which is a much lower figure. And could you give us a little bit of background on that analysis?
Yeah, sure. And we are continuing to evaluate that. We're preparing maps and evaluating what the potential is. But that comes from a pretty high level analysis of a few different things. One is the lotting pattern in the city of SLO, where lots in neighborhoods are often 6,000 square feet and smaller. And so that leaves relatively little opportunity to add that additional unit in a way that doesn't significantly modify the existing residence. And there are limitations on modification of existing residents, existing residential buildings, particularly when there has been, when a tenant has occupied the property in the last 3 years. And one thing we know is that in the city of San Luis Obispo, we have a very high rental percentage for our single family homes. So that number we're doing, the last time we looked at that number, it was about 50%. About 50% of the homes in the R1 zone are owner occupied, and about 50 are rented. And so that factor, that's a lower percentage than many communities across the state, and that would reduce the number of people that are able to pursue this type of project. So those are a couple of the, and then we also already discussed the prevalence of condominiums and HOAs in the city and in the R1 zone. So our look at that Turner study didn't seem like those types of properties were excluded. And so what we're seeing is a much lower potential in reality in terms of what we see people actually pursuing and wanting to develop. The Turner study looked at maximum number of units in all scenarios. And ultimately, we don't think that the development pattern of the lots in the city of SLO and and compared with the criteria in the legislation will produce anywhere near the maximum number of units that could potentially occur. But that still will need to be validated. Yeah, we'll continue to do the work on that.
You know, it sort of reminds me of the discussions we had about tiny homes and how many would we actually see happening. And that was a couple of years ago, I think, and we've had a couple of years of experience now. I know you won't have the figures, Michael, but there was concern about sort of approving the whole tiny homes approach. And what kind of impact have you seen? How many,
a very small number of tiny homes on wheels. You got a number there, Tyler?
I would say I've seen in the last couple of years, 3.
Yeah,
maybe 4.
But ADUs is a different story. Prior to our, like when we had a pretty permissive ADU ordinance, but still had an owner occupancy requirement, we were seeing permits, 25 to 35 a year. And now with no owner occupancy requirement, we're seeing more, like double that, like, 60 to 70 permits per year over the last 3 years for accessory dwelling units. So that owner occupancy requirement really seems to be something that, where if it's not an owner occupied parcel, so it's essentially an income property for somebody, opportunities to create more income are pursued at a higher percentage than for owner occupied properties. And in this case, there's that owner occupancy requirement.
Thank you.
Mike Wogan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Jorgensen. This is kind of a following up on Commissioner Dandekar's comments. I would like to request that staff share with us the analysis about how many potential units could result from implementation of SB 9, because I also am interested in how the staff's analysis, which it sounds like is a finer grain analysis than the study from Berkeley, how that, I would like to see how that differs and what the basis is of the conclusion about the 200 additional units. And so I'm interested in the SB 9's impact on the city's general plan build out and infrastructure, water supply, sewer capacity, et cetera. And so I would be interested in the staff sharing the results of your analysis with the Planning Commission at your earliest convenience.
Sure. Well, we can share the Turner study now. That's a completed piece of work. So we'll share that. We intend to manage development under SB 9 consistent with our current general plan build out. So in terms of utilities and service capacity within the urban reserve line, we're not projecting impacts because we have the ability to manage the overall program and production of housing within the population and unit limits identified in the general plan. So we'll continue to do that. And as we then do our own analysis to more firmly refine what we expect to occur. Like we'll start with the Turner study, but then we'll apply these criteria and come up with a more, what we think is a more accurate number for City of San Luis Obispo. Then we'll also share that with the Planning Commission.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
Yep.
Good idea.
Um,
Ema.
So Michael, just a follow-up clarification question. You stated the 6,000 square foot lot being a constraint, but one could still split up a 6,000 square foot lot into two, isn't that right? Because you just, I'm trying to remember, it was like 1,500 or 2,500 was the minimum lot size.
1,200.
I'm sorry?
1,200 square feet.
Right. I mean, it was really small. So why
Yeah,
does
well-
the 6,000 square foot kind of average size act as a deterrent?
Well, if you think about some of the different neighborhoods in the city, like say around Laguna Lake as an example, and you look at the way that homes are plotted on those 6,000 square foot lots. So we've got 20-foot street yards in the front and 5-foot setbacks on the side. And the home usually occupies that entire width of the lot at the frontage. And then you've got, usable rear yards. And so in that case, while you could do a lot split, you would have to significantly modify the primary residence, which you couldn't do if it had been leased by a tenant. If it had been occupied by a tenant over the past 3 years, then you wouldn't have the ability to do that. And then if you were going to do an urban lot split in that area, the lots have to be roughly equal. You can't create one lot of 1,750 square feet and the other of 5,000 or 4,750 square feet. It has to be like 6,000 or 60%, 40% is the maximum variance between the two lots. So in that, with that type of scenario, I would see more potential for a attached duplex type development. But again, there are parking requirements with SB9. There are impact fee requirements. There are a variety of other components to development of those lots that still remain a challenge. And I think Theresa included in her presentation the fact that these types of housing, they're consistent with what we think of as missing middle housing. They're not necessarily inconsistent with our housing element policy. And so while we recognize the concerns of the community in terms of new infill development that could change the pattern of development in a neighborhood, we also think that there are design solutions and that there are opportunities to design duplexes and do these urban lot splits in a way that would be very compatible with existing neighborhoods and maintain the streetscape so it's architecturally appealing and so we're maintaining the quality of life for the residents in those units and for the neighbors.
Thank you. So it's just difficult unless you have an owner-occupied lot. You have an owner-occupied lot that's 6,000 square feet, then the owner might be able to divide it up from front to back and take out some of the existing house, and you'd get two lots. But if it's been rented ever, then that's precluded under SB 9.
Yeah, for that 3-year period.
For that 3-year period.
Michael Hopkins, were you thinking of saying something? Okay, just checking. I can see everybody right now. And once I paste over my agenda, I can actually see hands up. So it's like I almost can run the meeting here, as long as I don't want to look at the agenda. I guess we've completed this. Thank you again, Michael and Teresa. Excellent presentation, and more to come. I guess that would be one way to summarize this. Got a lot to learn from it, and we're doing a lot of things ourselves, and some of these things will maybe be in sync, and that looks pretty good. So,
all right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just one question on this emergency. I'm sorry, this is a really hot topic, and I know a lot of people are very concerned. And I do appreciate the ways in which the staff has, really tried to tease this apart to see what makes sense for us. Teresa mentioned that you're looking at these emergency ordinances that cities are trying to pass, and is there a trigger point? You begin to see that there are unexpected impacts that you weren't seeing. We've got community members saying, boy, developers are really smart, and we're not seeing some of the ways they're going to come at us with projects we can't turn down. I think that may be a bit of a hyperbole, but suppose there are some loopholes that we haven't quite seen. And what's our ability how quickly can we react with emergency ordinance of some kind to say, whoops, we had to do that with ADUs. I mean, there was that window when suddenly people were coming in with very large ADUs before we got the ADU ordinance in place. How quickly could we react if we had to with an emergency ordinance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we can act, very quickly. We, to the extent that we see there are unforeseen outcomes that are negative, that we don't want to see repeated if that occurs, then that is something that could be addressed. I mean, if it's considered an emergency and 3 members of the city council want us to bring something forward, we bring it forward. And that's all it takes is direction from our city council. And if there's something that we see, we'll initiate that. So it's something that we're going to pay very close attention to, and we can act quickly.
And we did receive some questions about, well, if we don't act before January 1st, does that mean we just can't, that we lost our opportunity to create a ordinance, urgency or otherwise? And that's not the case. We can certainly bring forward either an urgency ordinance or as we have planned, address SB 9 concerns in ordinances that are currently underway in different work programs.
Yeah. And the ADU legislation was different than SB 9 legislation in that it actually set aside the local code. If the local code didn't comply with what the new state law was, it just set that aside. And that's not the case with SB 9. SB 9 tears off the local code, the local regulations.
Yeah, I would just add that, obviously the first few applications that we get, we're going to obviously pay ultra close attention to and understand, how that fits with our standards and the law. And we'll be working closely with our city attorney's office to make sure we get it right. And as Michael mentioned, if there's things that we would like to see changed in our code, I think within weeks we would be able to bring something forward if we're identifying on our own or directed by council to do so.
Thank you.
Good. I think we've made the most of this presentation. Thank you all. It was very, very helpful.
Right. Thank you.
So the last item is Tyler's update of upcoming planning agenda items.
Great. Well, thanks. I just real quickly, just want to acknowledge all the great work from that last presentation from, from Michael to Theresa, Owen, and our Assistant City Attorney, Markey. Everybody played a huge role over the last few weeks to try to get this presentation pulled together and get up to speed on not only what the law states, but what other jurisdictions are doing and how our codes fit into that. And I think they did an excellent job. So just wanted to say that. In terms of how we're looking forward with our forecast, this is the last meeting of the year. So it's been a big year for the Planning Commission. Just wanted to thank all the commissioners for all the excellent work, a lot of monstrous projects, especially in the fall here that we were able to push forward, especially objective design standards and zoning regs updates. So really appreciate all your work. And it's been a huge year for community development. But looking out, we do have a bit of a break until our first meeting in January, which is the 26th of January. And we have a couple items scheduled for that meeting, which first one would be, we do have a use permit scheduled. It's about a 21,000 square foot commercial recreation use. It's in the Marigold Shopping Center. And so that will be coming forward. And we also have a new 16,000 square foot commercial building coming from a recommendation from the Architecture Review Commission off of Impressa. It's 3490 Impressa. And so those two will be before you on the 26th. And then the next meeting is February 9th. One item on that agenda currently, it's an expansion of the existing residential care facility out at 55 Broad Street. It's an addition of 59 rooms to that facility. It includes a couple new buildings, and that's also coming forward from a recommendation from the Architecture Review Commission. So that's where I'm at with my forecast. Beyond that, it's a little subjective, so I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Any questions? I think we're ready to adjourn. We're adjourned.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Welcome, Emily.
Happy New Year.
Let's see you next
Thank
year,
you
Emily.
all. That was really interesting.
Happy holidays.
Yes.
You
to all
too.
of you.